China is the world's largest oyster farmer. Can you imagine that over 80% of all the oysters that end up on people's plates are currently grown somewhere along the Chinese coast? It sounds like a gold mine and the locals eat it, and oysters can be sold overseas to make money, but the people who live in coastal cities might disagree because they see more and more piles like this one, which are all oyster shells. To start, they don't look very nice, and they're basically pollution machines because different bacteria grow in the shells over time and can cause diseases and other problems. However, the Chinese have found a use for these piles. I've jumped throwing oyster shells into desolate, dying, or desert soil, so let's see what the Chinese have come up with this time. The Chinese and oysters have a long history together. In the past, these sea creatures were considered a good source of food, and in some regions, the Chinese even used. In 1058, scholar Cayenne developed a novel idea for constructing such bridges, growing oyster reefs around the foundation supports to structurally reinforce them and offer stable support. Yes, this is a bridge, but what do oysters have to do with it? Large-scale oyster farming in China was long thought to be impossible due to protection from strong weather waves. But in the 1980s, the industry began to flourish. The country's 11,000-mile coastline and ideal oyster growing conditions had to be used to meet a number of demands. And in 1983, the entire area of. In other words, if you saw one farm in the 1980s, less than 40 years later, it became 4 locations for raising shellfish. In 2006, the Chinese did the math and determined that oyster farms had grown from an estimated 62,000 acres to 91,000 acres by 1986, and then to an astounding 48,000 acres by 2020. 3 was their output volume, 89 million tons annually, and they were already making 81 million tons. 5% of all oysters produced worldwide, and that was before oyster farms reached their zenith in 2020, where they occupied an astounding 48,000 acres. Attained 5. As we enter this decade, China continues to produce more than 80% of the world's oysters, with 4 million tons produced a year. The provinces of Guangdong, Shandong, Guangxi, and Fujian are the main hubs of China's oyster business. The number of oyster farms in production is continuously increasing among the 5 because certain locations offer the finest conditions for oyster cultivation. A total of 4 million tons were produced. Overall, these provinces provide 6 million tons. Thus, their significance cannot be overstated. Oysters are creatures from which humans only need the meat in the middle, which makes up about 10% of the total mass. The rest is the shell, which is frequently thrown away everywhere in China. This is an example from Dongshan County, Fujian. However, the high production levels have also become somewhat of a challenge. A massive pile of oyster shells was recently dumped in a province. Of course, you could argue that oysters are a natural organism and therefore cannot really harm them. But because they don't break down biologically, bacteria can grow there and cause harm to people. Additionally, some studies indicate that oyster shells lying around are a major source of harmful gases like hydrogen sulfide and ammonia. And if we consider the situation with oyster waste in China generally, particularly in the provinces previously mentioned, it has already emerged as one of the primary sources of pollution in the coastal zone and is only getting worse. Since China's oyster farming and production areas are continuously growing, resulting in an annual increase in waste, in 2024, China produced approximately 3 million tons of oyster waste in the form of shells, the majority of which ended up in environmental pollution piles. At the same time, Chinese scientists in the province of Fujian started to. Scientists noticed that soil was gradually losing its fertility due to high soil acidity, which was caused by a number of careless and completely uncaring farming methods combined with a lot of rain. They came to the conclusion that oyster shells might be a solution in this case, so they buried an oyster shell. In this instance, Chinese soil scientists and other specialists worked with the armor of sea creatures, which was calcified at a temperature of 472 degrees F for 30 minutes before being transformed into a soil conditioner. If we assume that this is not the most effective activity, the end product would likely be soil with the shell inside. To test the hypothesis, the researchers also selected a 5-acre site in the province of Fujian. It should be mentioned that the experimental area contained a number of longan trees that, as a result of the high soil acidity, gradually started to die. The fruits were prone to cracking, and the overall crushed oyster shells were added to the soil in March 2022 as the condition of the trees deteriorated, meaning that the plants were dying because of the dying surface underneath them. The experiment ended in August of the same year, and upon sample collection and analysis, it was discovered that the pH level had dropped and the soil acidity had increased. How did this occur? The primary ingredient in oyster shells, calcium, is what causes the pH to rise. This is advantageous for plants growing in acidic soils because higher pH soils have more beneficial bacteria that convert nutrients like potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen into forms that plants can absorb more readily. Because the shells contain trace amounts of magnesium, sodium, copper, iron, and nickel, everything that grew in the oyster fertilized area was obviously grateful for the Chinese researchers' experiment, which showed that the soil's beneficial substances for plants increased by 49 to 57%. This resulted in the weight of the fruit from longan is growing by 37%, and worries about cracking and poor quality vanished. Yes, powdered oyster shells are excellent at converting dry soil into fertile soil. In addition, they discovered chives growing on the plot under study yet was problematic because of the dyeing. Until the oyster powder experiment began, their yield was actually struggling. It turns out that chives preferred oyster shells over longans, and their yield increased by a whole 57%. 8% plus a number of morphological indices saw a significant increase. The same researchers conducted an additional trial. A year after introducing pomelo tomatoes and luches to the troubled soil, they discovered that the pH of the pomelos had risen by 1. Organic matter had increased by 27 and by 1 unit. 7% of tomato-grown soil samples reveal that the exchangeable calcium content has gone up by 10. 45% of the soil that had oyster luches gained 1. In addition, it was discovered that in other control groups, the addition of oyster conditioner increased the pH by 36 units in comparison to the soil without any additives. It appears that the Chinese only need to establish large-scale oyster powder production to enable many crops to grow even on dying soils, as organic matter, nitrogen, and exchangeable calcium increased by 48%, 69%, and 32% respectively. However, there is still a question. What about other plants besides the ones we have already examined? The Chinese claim that oyster shells are a universal trick for transforming poor soil into something fit for cultivation. For instance, if you thought that peanuts and China were an odd combination, you'll be surprised to learn that the nation is the world's largest producer of peanuts. In 2013, for example, produced 37 million peanuts, or a little over 17 million tons. India, which farmed its peanuts on an even larger area minus 13 million acres, was next in line after China, accounting for 3% of the world crop at the time. This high number was made possible by 11 million acres of planted fields. Here is another noteworthy statistic about China. Even though their field area is less, they produce more peanuts. To put it numerically, China's yield is an astounding 8,000 pounds per 5 acres, although the harvest in India was just 4,000 pounds per 5 acres in spite of. Similar to other crops, Chinese peanuts had already begun to suffer from poor soil quality at that time. Of course, extreme pollution in China and desertification also played a role. Studies revealed that oyster powder could help save peanuts, but the results did not show a remarkable increase in soil fertility. Or yield the oyster shells didn't allow peanuts to be grown in the desert with an abnormally high number of crops. Researchers selected a specific region where peanut yields were low between 2013 and 2018, and the yield continued to decline annually, so they added an oyster conditioner. Next, the researchers examined the findings and discovered that while the pH of the soil had increased and the general state had improved, the peanut yield on each of the chosen plots continued to decline. Nevertheless, adding oyster shell fertilizer to the soil won't harm it. In fact, there are entire businesses dedicated to addressing the pollution. From 2018 saw the launch of a project to process oyster shells from Huan County at Wangchun City's Light Industry Park. The project covered 34 acres and had the capacity to process 120,000 tons of solid oyster shell waste annually, which is fantastic because, as you may recall, there are a lot of oyster piles in China and cutting them by 120,000 tons annually is a big help. But they can also use them to make 100,000 tons of soil conditioners in the same county. Oyster powder was tested on lettuce by the companies MA and Kang Xiao Xinyi Agricultural Development with assistance from the human government applied around 271 tons of soil conditioner to 1,800 acres of unproductive soil. Thus, the pH level of the soil increased from 5.11 to 6.05, greatly enhancing the soil cover while concurrently increasing the organic. The matter content rose by 37. The director of the Chinese Academy of Sciences Urban Carbon Neutrality Research Center also commented on this, saying that the usage of the soil conditioner resulted in a very excellent 20% rise in lettuce output, which was 6% higher than the levels prior to application. Oyster powder's role as a hero for Chinese soils and the environment is further supported by his remarks, which highlight yet another advantage of using oyster-based conditioners for soils with low fertility. Essentially, by increasing organic matter in the soil, carbon dioxide emissions are decreased, It was observed that one cycle of lettuce, oyster farming can reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 5,643 tons. It should be noted that applying a soil conditioner and then improving the quality of the soil can help prevent a number of food-related issues and give farmers an opportunity to increase their income. However, we didn't come up with this to highlight the significance of oysters. Just look at this. Soil conditioner improves soil quality without the use of chemicals, which means that fewer chemical fertilizers are needed. As a result, people will eat fewer vegetables, fruits, and other items that are grown in addition to using fewer chemicals. Implies lower expenses while improving the quality of agricultural products. Higher quality fruits and vegetables are more costly. Do you see the upside? In summary, the solution is ideal. All we need to do now is wait for the oyster soil conditioner to be widely used throughout China so that we can significantly lower the oyster population. In general, you get the idea that in China, there is a strong focus on learning how to use an oyster soil conditioner, which could eventually reach the deserts that the Chinese are actively greening. Shells transform dying lands into something more suitable for high yields and generate income. Helps to improve the waste situation and soil fertility, but China's efforts with oysters don't end there. Because of human impact, wild oysters are in a very vulnerable state. One of the rescue projects, the Nature Conservancy and the University of Hong Kong have been working since 2020 to restore an oyster habitat in the Pak Mang area of Hong Kong. It should be noted up front that the project is very complex because close by you have both Hong Kong and Shenzhen, two cities that are hardly peaceful or mindful of the surrounding nature. These two enormous settlements have been working for a long time to quickly consume all the. Despite having resources nearby, enterprising people were able to accomplish something amazing. They established oyster reefs in the old muddy shallows close to Pak Nang, a historic village along the deep bay in the northern part of the new territories in Hong Kong. After oysters were harvested, they placed posts into the muddy shallows. Yes, this is how sea creatures were raised here. Hundreds or even thousands of perfectly standing sticks that served as oysters' homes. Later, a more contemporary technique that grew oysters on rafts floating in the water replaced this one, but ecologists have now chosen to restore oysters using the time-tested post. The posts were placed in random piles that resembled natural oyster reefs, moving toward the sea where the tidal zone is wetter and oysters flourish, restoring coastal and tidal habitats to a more natural state. This was the only change made to populations where they had vanished. Most oyster reef restoration projects. Posts that were once used for oyster farming come into play because the waters surrounding Hong Kong are so full of larvae that oysters grow on their own and only need a substrate to attach to. In fact, the larvae of marine creatures have completely covered the substrate, necessitating the planting of young oysters raised in nurseries. Provided by humans, while biodiversity research found 10 times more biomass and 61 species on abandoned farms as opposed to 26 species on nearby muddy shores. Project participants say they aren't yet certain that the solution is very effective, but they say that at least they were able to increase the number of. The restoration of natural oyster populations in Hong Kong is a crucial task for oyster reefs. Horseshoe crabs are creatures that have been cruising the waters and shores of our planet for millions of years. In 2020, a small crab with the complicated Latin name Nanisarma ponchiana was discovered for the first time. Are intricate three-dimensional structures that comprise a significant marine ecosystem, and their restoration can help lessen the harm brought about by urbanization and safeguard the region's marine treasures. Oysters are also a very effective water filter. One species, Magellana Hong Kong incense, has one of the highest filtration rates. According to scientists, a reef covering 75 square feet can filter an entire Olympic-sized pool every day. Does this imply that oysters are the rescuers of China's coastal waters and arid lands? They are a universal creature that is difficult to replace in nature. Among all oyster species, they can filter up to 8 gallons of water per hour during the summer. Apparently, China is fully aware of this, and although oyster projects aren't very popular right now, they will undoubtedly become so soon.